In just 5 minutes, Jasmine Crockett, a black female attorney, was insulted, threatened, and humiliated by a powerful federal judge. But minutes later, she exposed him so brutally that the FBI walked into the courtroom with handcuffs. This isn't just a courtroom drama, it's the collapse of a corrupt empire. What else was Judge Carter hiding? And how deep does the rot go? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Federal Courtroom 3B was not a place where surprises typically occurred. It was the kind of courtroom where bureaucracy reigned, where the days bled into one another, and the calendar flipped without resistance. But not today. Today, beneath the dull gleam of worn ceiling lights and between the groaning wooden benches that had seen decades of quiet verdicts, something unspoken began to shift. The case was simple. At least that's how it was filed. The United States versus Faith and Family Foundation. On paper, it was a standard fraud hearing. The charges: misappropriation of donor funds, potential laundering, and intentional misrepresentation of organizational purpose. But those words, cold, bureaucratic, clinical, masked a more dangerous narrative. Because what sat at the heart of this case was not numbers, but beliefs. Faith and Family was no backroom operation. It had operated for over 20 years, building schools, funding addiction recovery programs, supporting military families, and yes, loudly supporting pro-life and pro-faith policy. Their donors were mostly working-class families from red states. Veterans, ministers, teachers, moms. People who scraped together $20 checks to keep the light on, believing that their money went to something bigger than politics. And yet, here they were, dragged into court under a cloud of suspicion that felt anything but impartial. No one missed the irony. The judge presiding over this case, Henry Maxwell Carter, had a record so openly antagonistic to conservative groups, it practically glowed in the dark. In the last 7 years, he had dismissed 24 similar foundations as shields for political propaganda, and once called faith-based charities the velvet glove of radical influence. He rarely hid his disdain. He didn't need to. He was the law here. What nobody in that courtroom yet realized, not the prosecutor sipping his coffee, not the twitchy clerk flipping through her docket, not even Carter tapping his gavel in irritation, was that this wasn't going to be just another case. This wasn't a trial about a spreadsheet. This was about whether truth still stood a chance against power when the power wore a robe. And Faith and Family? They weren't the ones on trial today. Not really. Today, it was the system itself being weighed. And before it was over, someone was going to fall. The doors opened with a slow, deliberate groan, and every conversation in the courtroom died mid-sentence. Jasmine Crockett stepped inside, not hurried, not hesitant, but with the gravity of someone walking into a war she knew was already stacked against her. The fluorescent lights caught the edge of her glasses and glinted off the silver clip binding a thick stack of documents clutched tight in her left hand. Her suit, navy blue and sharp at the shoulders, cut through the beige monotony of the room like a scalpel through cloth. She moved without apology, without deference, heels clicking crisply across the tile floor in a rhythm that dared anyone to interrupt it. The clerk's eyes widened slightly. A juror in the back straightened in his seat. Even the court reporter paused, as if unsure whether to start a new page. Jasmine didn't glance left or right. Her gaze was locked on the bench, where the man who'd ruled this room like a monarch leaned back with thinly veiled disdain. Judge Henry Maxwell Carter raised an eyebrow, not out of surprise, but irritation. The kind of irritation born from entitlement, a man so used to controlling the narrative, he resented any character he didn't cast himself. His robe draped heavily over his frame like armor, but Jasmine wasn't intimidated. She had walked into rooms like this before, rooms where her presence alone was a provocation, where the combination of her skin color, her youth, and her position made people assume she must be someone's assistant, not the one carrying the evidence that could collapse their empire. Judge Henry Maxwell Carter reclined ever so slightly in his high-backed chair, the thick folds of his black robe cascading like drapes over a throne. His fingers tapped once, twice, then steepled in front of his face as he stared down at Jasmine Crockett. Not like an equal, not even like an opponent, but like an intruder. His smirk spread slowly, the corners of his mouth curling upward with practiced arrogance. The room had grown quiet, as if everyone sensed he was winding up for something. And then, with a voice laced in poison, dressed as authority, he delivered his line. "You think this is the White House, Ms. Crockett?" His tone was thick with condescension, dragging out her title like it offended him to say it. "Let me explain how this works. In here, I am the law." The effect was instantaneous and brutal. Laughter erupted across the courtroom like a match dropped in dry grass. It wasn't just a chuckle here or there. It was collective, corrosive. Jurors looked at each other and smiled. One man near the gallery let out a low whistle and said, "Oof, she walked into that one." The court clerk lowered her gaze, clearly uncomfortable, but said nothing. Even the prosecutor cracked a grin, shaking his head as if to say, "That's what you get for showing up where you don't belong." And in that moment, Jasmine wasn't just alone. She was surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned. To them, she was the outsider, a woman who didn't wear a robe, a black woman, young, confident, uninvited, walking into a place built to grind people like her into dust. The laughter wasn't about the joke. It was about making sure she knew exactly where she stood, beneath them. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't shrink, didn't fumble for her papers, didn't adjust her seat or bite her lip or blink away the humiliation they tried to drown her in. She let them laugh. She let it fill the room like smoke, thick and suffocating. And then when the noise finally began to fade, when the echoes of their mockery started to die down, she struck. Not with anger, not with volume, but with a calm so sharp it could cut glass. She turned her head toward the bench slowly, deliberately, her eyes locking onto Judge Carter's with unshakable precision. "Law," she said, her voice smooth but ironclad, "is not something to be bent by whoever holds the gavel." The words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They simply landed, solid, undeniable, like steel dropped on marble. The courtroom went still, completely still. Someone coughed. Another cleared their throat. A juror's pen fell silent mid-scribble. It was as if her voice had sliced the oxygen out of the room. She continued, her tone unwavering, her presence anchored. "It's not a tool for ego. It's not a mask for bias. And it's not a crown for a man who confuses power with righteousness." That last sentence didn't just land. It detonated. The silence that followed was no longer dismissive. It was tense, uncertain, shifting. Judge Carter's jaw tightened. The smirk that once held court over the room faltered, his lips pressing into a thin line of restrained fury. He wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not like this. Not so publicly, not so unapologetically, and never by someone who came armed not with excuses, but with facts. Jasmine sat back, her hands folded calmly over the stack of documents she'd brought like weapons of war. She didn't look around to see who still doubted her. She didn't have to. The power had shifted, and she'd done it without raising her voice. Just like that, the courtroom remembered. This wasn't a performance. This was a reckoning. The moment the last echo of laughter faded into the walls, Jasmine reached forward and unfastened the thick binder in front of her with a quiet, deliberate click. She didn't glance up. She didn't ask for permission. Her fingers moved with practiced certainty, flipping past the first few pages until she landed exactly where she intended. Then she spoke, not loudly, not hurriedly, but with the kind of quiet precision that silenced doubt. "The Faith and Family Foundation," she began, her voice steady as steel wire, "is not guilty of financial misconduct. It is guilty only of operating under values that some people in this room find inconvenient." A ripple moved through the gallery, not quite a sound, but a shift in posture, a flicker of attention. Jasmine turned a page, held it up for the judge, the jury, and every spectator to see. "This is an independent audit report conducted by Simmons and Hawley, dated March 1st, fully compliant, fully transparent." Her eyes rose then and locked directly onto Carter. "And this," she said, tapping the next document, "is a donor ledger showing every transaction, publicly disclosed down to the penny." Carter's jaw clenched and the tips of his fingers tapped impatiently on the arm of his chair. He didn't interrupt, yet, but the tension in his posture screamed. Jasmine went on, flipping to the next set of papers, with the calm of someone walking through a fire she refused to acknowledge. The accusations in this case didn't arise from accounting errors, she said. They originated in a media campaign launched by affiliates of the Liberty Fund, which, coincidentally, has a track record of targeting faith-based organizations with opposing political alignment. She let that hang for a moment, then continued. In other words, this isn't about fraud, it's about framing. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, whispering something to his aide. The court clerk stiffened. The jurors were now fully focused, some leaning forward, others scribbling notes faster than before. But Jasmine's tone never changed. Your Honor, she said, her gaze unwavering, this courtroom was weaponized before I ever stepped into it. My job today is to show you where the bullets came from. Judge Carter exploded, slamming his open palm against the bench so hard that a tremor ran through his gavel, rattling the glasses of water on the attorneys' tables. This is a courtroom, not a Trump press briefing, he roared, his voice cracking through the chamber like a gunshot. The walls reverberated with his fury, and the spectators jolted in their seats, startled by the sheer venom behind his outburst. His face had flushed a deep, dangerous red, and a vein pulsed visibly on his temple. He wasn't just angry, he was losing control. You think you can walk in here with your headlines and your politics and hijack my courtroom? He barked. This isn't cable news, Miss Crockett. I won't tolerate grandstanding from anyone, especially not from a political pawn. The word pawn landed with intention, a blade meant to cut beneath the surface. The clerk looked down. A juror blinked rapidly, unsure where to look. For a moment, it seemed like Carter had reclaimed the room by sheer brute force, but only for a moment. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply closed the binder in front of her with slow precision and leaned back in her chair like a fighter catching her breath between rounds. If you're not interested in hearing the truth about faith and family, she said, her voice low but unmistakably sharp, then perhaps you prefer we talk about the Liberty Fund instead. The name hit the room like a dropped grenade. The air tightened. Someone in the gallery audibly inhaled. Carter froze, just for a second. But in that second, something shifted. His rage didn't vanish, but it flickered, hesitated. Jasmine continued, folding her hands calmly over the close file. Because I have just as much to say about them. And unlike speculation, what I have is documented, time-stamped, and signed by you. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The courtroom that had laughed at her minutes ago was now dead silent. And at the center of it all sat Judge Henry Maxwell Carter, suddenly very still, very pale, and for the first time no longer sure who was on trial. His voice dropped, quieter now, but all the more venomous for it. Say one more word, he hissed, his eyes locked on Jasmine like a predator sizing up his target. And I will personally petition the White House for your dismissal. A hush swept over the room, but it wasn't the quiet of respect. It was the stillness that comes when everyone senses a line has been crossed. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered above the keyboard, motionless. The implication was brutal and crystal clear. Challenge this man in his courtroom, and he'll end not just your credibility, but your entire career. The threat wasn't legal. It was political, personal, vicious. A power move meant to humiliate her in public and destroy her in private. Jasmine's jaw tensed, but she didn't break eye contact. She had faced injustice before, but rarely had it been so brazen, so proudly wielded from behind a bench meant to protect fairness. The energy in the room shifted. A ripple of unease spread through the audience. Lawyers exchanging glances, a reporter in the back scribbling faster now, a veteran in the gallery narrowing his eyes. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just about one charity anymore. Carter's aggression wasn't judicial, it was desperate. Jasmine didn't speak, not yet, but her silence screamed louder than any protest. She didn't need to argue that something was wrong. The judge had just told the world himself, with his threat, his tone, his fear. And for the first time since the hearing began, people in the courtroom began to wonder, what exactly is this woman holding in that binder? And why is Carter so afraid of it? Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached into the binder with the calm of someone unsheathing a blade. She pulled out a printed document, 4 pages stapled cleanly at the corner, and held it up for the court to see. "This is a bank statement from the Cayman National Bank," she said evenly, dated March the 16th, one day after Judge Carter handed down a ruling against the American Liberty Coalition, a conservative organization denied standing in this very courtroom. She walked to the evidence display with deliberate steps, clipped it to the projector, and hit the button. The screen lit up, revealing Carter's name printed neatly under the recipient field, followed by the number, $100,000. There was an audible intake of breath from the gallery. A pin could have dropped and echoed. Jasmine turned back to face the room, eyes steady. "The deposit came from an offshore holding company traced back to Liberty Fund affiliates," she continued. "No invoice, no service rendered, no explanation, just silence and a 6-figure reward." Judge Carter's hand twitched on the bench, fingers drumming faster now, betraying the panic rising beneath his carefully composed scowl. "That document is irrelevant," he barked, but there was a crack in his voice now, small but unmistakable. Jasmine didn't blink. "Then why was it followed," she said, flipping to the next page, "by another deposit, this time $75,000, 2 weeks after a separate ruling that blocked funding for another conservative nonprofit?" She slid the next document into view. Same bank, same offshore entity, same silence. The room had stopped breathing. Even the clerk, whose hands had been trembling minutes ago, stared openly at the screen, frozen. Jasmine took one step forward, voice still calm but now edged with fire. "Is it your position, Your Honor, that all these deposits were just coincidence?" she asked, each syllable cutting sharper than the last. "Because if so, I have 8 more pages of coincidence right here." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, charged, like a lightning strike waiting to fall. Jasmine reached into her binder again, her movements precise, surgical, as if every page she touched was a detonator. "Bank statements alone," she said, her voice unwavering, "might raise questions. But emails? Emails answer them." She pulled out 2 printed sheets, thick paper, bold headers, timestamps locked to the second. "This," she said, lifting the first page and walking it to the overhead projector, "is an email sent from Judge Carter's official address, HCARTER, at fedva.courts.gov, to an executive at the Liberty Fund, time-stamped March 17th at 8:43 a.m. The screen lit up with the text, bold and damning. "Thank you for the timely support. The issue with the Liberty Coalition has been resolved as discussed." Jasmine let the silence stretch for a beat, then looked up at Carter. "That email was sent less than 24 hours after the $100,000 deposit hit your account," she said, "and one day after you ruled against them in a case that, until your intervention, had overwhelming evidence on their side." The judge's lips parted, but no words came. His face had gone a shade paler, the red in his cheeks replaced by something closer to ash. Jasmine didn't stop. She lifted the second page. "And here," she continued, "is a follow-up email from April 9th. Same sender, same recipient, different subject line." She flipped it onto the screen. The subject line read, "Faith and Family. The Body. The case will be handled as expected. Appreciate your continued trust." Gasps rose from the gallery now. No longer whispers, but raw reactions. One woman clutched her mouth. A man in the back muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." Jasmine turned back to Carter. "Your Honor," she said, each word deliberate and ice cold, "this isn't just coordination, it's conspiracy. You didn't just rule. You planned. You promised." She folded her arms across her chest, staring at him like a prosecutor already giving the closing argument. "And the people in this courtroom deserve to know. Who else did you promise?" The air was thick enough to choke on. Carter gripped the bench like it was the only thing holding him upright. He wasn't in control anymore, and everyone knew it. Carter's grip on the bench began to fail him, fingers twitching as if struggling to obey the commands of a brain spiraling into panic. His mouth opened, but what came out wasn't language. It was a stuttered gasp, a jumble of syllables fighting to form a denial that never quite arrived. Those documents are..." "That's not real," he sputtered, but the words collapsed midair like broken scaffolding. A dark sheen of sweat glistened across his forehead, and a thick droplet rolled down the side of his face, disappearing into the collar of his once starched white shirt, now visibly damp and clinging to his neck like a noose. His hand reached for his pen out of instinct, a judge's final prop, the symbol of control, but his fingers fumbled and the pen slipped, clattering against the wood and spinning across the courtroom floor with an accusing ring. The room didn't breathe. The fall of that pen sounded like a gavel in reverse, the sound of judgment crumbling. Jasmine didn't even look up. She was mid-sentence, her voice steady, slicing through the room like a scalpel through silk. "May 3rd, she read aloud, lifting another page, her tone clinical and cold. $50,000 transferred from Basalt Holdings Limited. Same Cayman account, same Liberty Fund ties. This occurred 48 hours after the sealed suppression of whistleblower testimony in the Mitchell versus Liberty case." Her eyes finally flicked toward the bench, sharp as a blade unsheathed. "Is that another coincidence, Your Honor?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It was a challenge delivered with the calm fury of someone who'd endured too much silence, too much corruption, and too many men like him. Carter's lips trembled, jaw clenched so tight it quivered, his body no longer seated in command but locked in survival mode. The man who once ruled from that bench now looked like he was drowning in his own robe. And Jasmine, she didn't stop, because injustice didn't stop, not until someone like her forced it to. Suddenly the mask cracked and the judge roared. "Lies!" Carter shouted, his voice rasping like an engine stripped of oil. "This is fabricated garbage. Doctored files. You think I'm going to sit here and let a political puppet smear my name?" His chair scraped backward as he jolted to his feet, face flushed, veins bulging at his neck like ropes about to snap. The air in the courtroom trembled, not from his authority, but from the sheer desperation laced in every syllable. "These are forged!" he barked again, pointing a shaking finger at the projector screen, now displaying his own name tied to foreign wire transfers. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he spat, eyes burning holes into Jasmine. "Just another mouthpiece in a suit, sent by the White House to take me down." But no one moved. No one spoke. Even the clerk looked frozen in her seat, pen halted midline. This wasn't the voice of a man confident in his innocence. This was the scream of someone watching his armor shatter in real time. Jasmine remained seated, her face still and unreadable, but her silence was louder than his tantrum. She let the storm rage, and then, with chilling control, flipped to the next page in the binder, like she hadn't just been screamed at by a federal judge. Carter's fist clenched, knuckles white, but his voice cracked again. "This is a setup. All of it. I don't even know half the people she's talking about." His words were frantic now, flailing, and somewhere in the gallery someone whispered what everyone was thinking. "He's unraveling." And for the first time, the courtroom wasn't afraid of him. They were watching him fall. The courtroom sat frozen in the tension Jasmine had carved open, but she didn't bask in the silence. She drove through it. As the final document from her binder was projected onto the screen, another damning wire transfer, another judge's signature, another lie caught in the light. She paused. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped, just slightly, steady and deliberate, signaling the shift from confrontation to revelation. "This," she said, "isn't just about one judge in a few corrupted cases. This is about what happens when power hides behind robes and titles, and no one dares to ask why." Her words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, lingering, undeniable, dangerous. She took a breath, then added, "This isn't new. It's just exposed." She turned from the screen and stepped forward, the weight of her next words gathering behind her like a wave. "In 2018, a judge in West Virginia was found guilty of taking money from a private prison company," she said, her eyes scanning the courtroom slowly. "Why? So he could hand out longer sentences, not based on justice, based on profit." The gasp that rose from the gallery wasn't theatrical. It was horrified. Jasmine nodded once, solemn. That man put teenagers behind bars for decades, because every year of prison time meant money in his pocket. She let that settle, then stepped even closer to the jury box, voice like a steady drum. He wore a robe just like Judge Carter. He spoke of law just like him. And people trusted him, just like this courtroom trusted this bench. Then came the dagger, quiet, cold, and aimed straight at the soul. And just like now, no one saw it coming, she said, because no one wanted to believe a judge could sell justice. Her gaze swept across the room. Jury, press, spectators, even the bailiff. But here's the truth. If we stay silent, justice gets auctioned off behind closed doors. She pointed to the screen again, where Carter's signature glowed beside the timestamp. This isn't fiction. This is happening. Today, in this room. The weight of her voice didn't shout. It pressed down like gravity. And for the first time, many in that courtroom realized they weren't watching a trial. They were watching a warning. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The room had already tipped, perched on the edge of something irreversible. And then, without fanfare, she reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and pulled out a slim, matte black digital recorder. It was small, insignificant to look at, but the way she held it, raised gently at chest level like an offering to the truth, made the air itself seem to recoil. Every eye in the room followed the movement. Carter leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes, nostrils flaring, not with curiosity, but with a primal, silent panic. Jasmine's thumb hovered over the play button for only a second. Then she pressed it. The recorder beeped once, and then came the voice. It was grainy but unmistakable, low, commanding, threaded with arrogance. "Delete all the Faith and Family files," the voice ordered. A pause then. "If anyone asks, say they were misplaced." Silence fell like a slab of stone. The courtroom, alive with murmurs seconds ago, froze. The voice wasn't edited, wasn't AI generated, wasn't paraphrased. It was real. Raw. It was Judge Henry Maxwell Carter, in his own voice, giving a direct order to erase evidence in an active federal case. The first sound to break the silence was the thud of someone's pen falling to the floor. Then a breath, sharp and panicked, from the clerk's bench. The young court clerk, no older than 30, sat rigid in her chair, her eyes locked on the recorder as if it were a loaded weapon. Her hands began to tremble, her mouth parted. For a moment she tried to hold it in, biting her lip, squeezing her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. But the dam broke. "I didn't want to," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He made me." Heads turned. Her shoulders shook as she tried to continue, her breath hitching with every syllable. "He said if I didn't delete the files, if I didn't do exactly what he told me, I'd never work again." She looked straight ahead, eyes wide and glistening. "He said no one would believe me, that it'd be his word over mine." The tears came now, hot and unrestrained. She covered her mouth with one hand, the other still clenched around her notepad like it might keep her from falling apart completely. Across the courtroom, you could feel the axes shift. This wasn't politics. This wasn't debate. This was coercion, recorded and confessed, witnessed in real time by a room that could no longer pretend not to see. A juror audibly whispered, "My God!" Another leaned forward, forehead in his hand, eyes wide in disbelief. The defense attorney beside Jasmine sat back slowly in her chair, lips parted, staring at Carter like she'd never seen him before. Carter didn't move. He didn't breathe. The color had drained from his face, his features locked in a frozen mass that teetered between rage and ruin. He opened his mouth slightly, but no sound came. Not a word. Not a denial. Not even a protest. Because what could he say? It was his voice, his words, his orders to bury the truth and destroy lives to protect his own. Jasmine finally broke the silence, not with volume, but with gravity. "That was your voice, Your Honor," she said, turning to face him squarely, her tone low and devastatingly calm. "That wasn't taken out of context. That wasn't speculation. That was you, giving a direct order to obstruct justice." She stepped forward once, her voice rising, not in anger, but in command. "You didn't just break the law. You shattered the public trust. and you used fear as your shield while threatening the very people sworn to serve this court." She turned then to the clerk, whose head was bowed, shoulders still shaking. Jasmine's voice softened. "You were brave," she said gently. "You're not the one on trial today." Then she turned back to Carter, her eyes now sharp enough to pierce steel. "But you are." She raised the recorder again. "And this isn't hearsay. This is confession, on tape, before a courtroom, before a nation, and before every person you swore to serve, but chose instead to betray." No one spoke. No one coughed. No one dared to move. It wasn't just that Jasmine had exposed corruption. It was that she'd done it with undeniable, irreversible clarity. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't stormed. She'd let the truth speak for itself. And in doing so, she'd stripped a federal judge bare in front of the system that once shielded him. And all she had to do was press play. The moment hung in electric suspension. One breath, two, and then it shattered. The rear doors of the courtroom didn't open gently. They burst apart with a force that made the entire room flinch. Even the bailiff flinched. Every conversation stopped mid-syllable. Every head turned. Silence dropped like a curtain as four figures stepped inside. Broad-shouldered, black-suited, armed not with weapons but authority. The letters across their chests made the room inhale sharply as one. FBI. They didn't yell. They didn't need to. Their presence roared in every step that echoed down the marble aisle like war drums. They walked with the precision of a closing trap. The spectators instinctively pulled back, chairs scraping against tile, jurors frozen in place, some with mouths still open from the last shock. One agent took the lead, tall, calm, his face carved from granite, and when he spoke, his voice was steady thunder. "Judge Henry Maxwell Carter," the agent declared, voice projected to every corner of the chamber. "You are under arrest for bribery, obstruction of justice, and destruction of federal evidence." It hit the room like a bomb. Audible gasps. A woman dropped her phone. A man in the gallery clapped once before catching himself. Carter didn't move. Not at first. His face went from white to ashen, then flushed red, like blood couldn't decide whether to stay or flee. His eyes darted toward Jasmine, then to the jury, then to the agents. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then, without warning, he lurched to the side. He ran. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't calculated. It was animal. Pure instinct. His black robe tangled around his legs as he leapt down from the bench, nearly tripping over the hem. He shoved past the stunned court clerk, knocking her files to the floor. "I won't let you do this to me," he screamed, voice cracking into something almost childlike. "I'm a federal judge. I have immunity. I have rights." He didn't head for the main door. He bolted toward the judge's private chamber, the side hallway that once promised refuge, now his last escape route. But justice had already accounted for that. Two agents moved simultaneously. One blocked the hallway with a clean pivot, arm raised in warning. The second intercepted Carter at the side, grabbing his arm mid-stride. The judge twisted, snarled, elbowed, thrashed, his movements wild, incoherent, nothing like the man who had once sat towering above the courtroom like a god. "Get off me! This is a trap, a setup," he bellowed. But it was no use. His left wrist was yanked behind him, then the right, and then click. The metallic bite of the handcuffs echoed like a final verdict. Carter froze, his shoulders jerking once as if in disbelief that the cold steel wasn't a hallucination, that it was real, that it was over. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in noise. Cheers from the back row, stunned murmurs, a shout of "finally" from the gallery. Cell phones shot up. Flashbulbs popped like a paparazzi ambush. Someone whispered, "Get this live." A woman with tears in her eyes clapped slowly, deliberately. The very same courtroom that had laughed at Jasmine when she walked in now stood to record the moment she turned the entire system upside down. Carter spun wildly as the agents restrained him. "You're making a mistake. I didn't do anything wrong," he shouted, though the strain in his voice betrayed the collapse of his defenses. His robe was half off his shoulder now, his tie pulled loose, sweat soaking through the collar of his shirt in dark stains. His once slicked hair stuck to his forehead in damp strands, and in his eyes no more fire, no more judgment, only fear, raw, undiluted fear. "This is political," he shrieked. "I'm the law here." Jasmine stepped forward, calm, upright, unflinching. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to say, "Not anymore." The image said it all. The man who had once tried to destroy her career was now shackled, his reputation dissolving in real time, dragged away under federal custody, while she stood, silent and still, the last woman standing. As the FBI led Carter down the aisle, the crowd parted like a tide. People leaned in with their phones, capturing every second. The bailiff didn't move to stop them. Even he looked relieved. One of the jurors, older, grayer, whispered to his neighbor, "That's what justice looks like." And then the doors shut behind Carter, a man once untouchable, now undone. While the courtroom still buzzed from Carter's arrest, down the corridor behind the bench, through a door few outside staff had ever entered, his private office sat in thick, artificial silence, a place meant to be a sanctuary of law, now reduced to a crime scene. The FBI's forensic team moved with discipline, opening drawers, photographing every frame, sweeping every shelf for hidden compartments. A ceiling fan clicked above, the only sound competing with the soft whir of latex gloves moving through files and folders. The bookshelves were lined with legal volumes, some never opened, some hollowed out. The desk, dark cherry wood, ornate, had 3 locked drawers. The third required a pry bar. Inside that bottom drawer was a cardboard folder, unlabeled, tucked behind a false panel barely half an inch thick. One agent pulled it out, opened it, and paused. "Agent Morris," he called, voice flat but urgent. The lead agent stepped forward, took the file, and unfolded it carefully under the light. For a moment he said nothing, just stared at the list stapled to the inside flap. Typed, aligned, systemic. 7 federal judges. Names well known in legal circles. Next to each, a case ID, a Liberty Fund shell company name, a corresponding bank transfer date, and the amount, one by one. No ambiguity, no guessing. Every entry was clean, damning, and frighteningly organized. He turned the page, another sheet, case summaries, cross-referenced decisions where conservative organizations had been mysteriously denied fair trial access. Rulings suppressed, evidence sealed, motions thrown out. Agent Morris exhaled, a long, bitter breath. "This isn't just Carter," he said. "This is a coordinated system." A network. Jasmine Crockett had been standing quietly just outside the doorway, her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the edges of the operation like a hawk waiting for the wind to shift. She stepped inside now, slow, measured, heels clicking softly on the polished tile. She said nothing at first, just looked down at the document in Morris's hand. She read the names, her expression carved from stone. Then she spoke, and her voice filled the room with a force that made the agents straighten unconsciously. "If there are more like him out there," she said, "then I won't just help you find them. I'll drag every last one of them into the light." Agent Morris glanced up. "This list," he said, lifting the page slightly, "this is bigger than any corruption case we've touched in the last decade." Jasmine nodded once, eyes locked on the page. "Which means it's exactly where we start," she replied. "This isn't just about bribes. It's about trust, broken in the highest offices of justice. These men weren't just bought. They sold the law. And they did it behind closed doors with the flag behind them and the Constitution under their feet." Another agent nearby, younger, looked visibly shaken. "Do you think it goes beyond judges?" he asked. Jasmine's answer came without hesitation. "Of course it does," she said. "Money doesn't stop at one office. It moves through every crack unless someone seals the whole damn wall." She turned back toward the door, but paused, glancing over her shoulder. "I'll testify. I'll bring more evidence. Whatever it takes. But promise me one thing." Agent Morris raised an eyebrow. "Don't just go after the easy ones," she said. "Go after the ones who thought they were too powerful to ever get caught." He gave a tight nod. "We will." She stepped out, and the agents returned to their work, bagging the documents, sealing boxes, photographing every inch of the corrupted office once cloaked in credibility. But the story had changed now. Carter wasn't the climax. He was the first domino. The air inside the courtroom remained heavy, thick not just with shock, but with the quiet, dawning realization of something much darker. As Agent Morris held up the sheet of names, another gasp rippled from the gallery, not loud but sharp, like a memory ripping open. A man seated near the back, gray hair, eyes wide, leaned forward, eyes fixed on the paper being sealed into an evidence bag. I stood trial in front of the third judge on that list, he said aloud, barely above a whisper, yet somehow it carried. He threw out my case without letting me speak. He blinked, as if trying to reconcile the injustice of years past with the truth unfolding now. Now I understand why. His voice cracked, not with anger, but with something more dangerous. Vindication. A murmur swept through the spectators like wind through dry grass. The room wasn't just watching justice. It was suddenly remembering its own wounds. At the front of the room, the representative for the Faith and Family Foundation, an older man with a weathered face and tired eyes, stood motionless, hands clenched tightly at his sides. For a moment he looked frozen, as if the chaos had numbed him. Then slowly his shoulders shook, and he raised both hands to his face. He didn't speak. He just broke. Silently at first, then with a gasp so raw it cut straight through the silence. "You saved us," he choked, tears spilling down his cheeks as he looked at Jasmine. "You saved our name, and you saved our belief that the system could still be something more than a weapon." His voice cracked again. "You didn't just defend the foundation. You defended the very idea of justice." Jasmine didn't respond right away. Her eyes softened, but she didn't smile. She couldn't. Not in this room. Not yet. She nodded once, her throat tight, her posture still strong, because she knew what everyone else was just beginning to understand. The fight wasn't over. The mask had been ripped off one face, but the rot ran deeper. And if she had to walk into 10 more courtrooms like this, against 10 more Carters, she would. Because today wasn't just about one verdict. It was about proving that justice, when fought for relentlessly, still had a pulse. And it had just started to beat louder. The courthouse steps were no longer just concrete. They had become a stage, an altar, where truth had just demanded its place in history. The doors creaked open one final time that afternoon, and the crowd outside surged forward as Jasmine Crockett emerged. Her posture was calm but unshakable, her black suit dusted with the weight of everything she had just torn through inside. But on her face, no fatigue, no surrender. Only the piercing clarity of someone who had stared into the machine and forced it to blink first. Flash bulbs exploded like lightning in a storm. Journalists screamed her name from all directions. "Ms. Crockett, is Carter just the beginning? Will there be more arrests? What does this mean for the federal bench?" But she didn't rush. She didn't panic. She descended those granite steps with the composure of a soldier returning from battle. Scarred, sure, but victorious. A man thrust a microphone in her face. Cameras swarmed like a tide. Still, she kept walking until she reached the final step, and then she stopped. Silence fell, as if the crowd knew the gravity of what was about to come. Jasmine looked directly into the lens of the camera in front of her, the red recording light glowing like a living witness. She didn't smile. Her voice didn't tremble. "No one," she said, "is above the law. Not a donor, not a party, not a judge. No one." She let the words hang in the air, let them settle like dust after a collapse. "And if this courtroom taught us anything today," she continued, "it's that justice isn't something we wait for. It's something we fight for." A wave of cheers erupted. Someone in the back shouted her name. Flash after flash lit up her face like gunfire frozen in time. But this wasn't just about applause. In the minutes that followed, the internet did what the internet does best. It caught fire. The video of Judge Carter being escorted in cuffs down the aisle, robe disheveled, shouting, "I am the law," while Jasmine stood behind him, calm and unrelenting, was clipped and shared at light speed. Within 23 minutes, it had racked up 1.2 million views. By the end of the hour, 5 million, then 10. It wasn't just trending, it was transforming. Hashtags bloomed across platforms like banners raised on digital battlegrounds. # Justice for Faith, # Crockett for Justice, # No One Above the Law. Teenagers who didn't care about politics posted it with captions like, "This is how you do it." Veterans shared it with the words, "We fought for this." One viral post read, "She didn't scream. She didn't fold. She brought truth into a room built to silence it." And then came the veteran. He stood alone at the edge of the press crowd, tall, broad-shouldered, his silver hair tucked under a faded U.S. Army cap. No camera crew followed him. No interview awaited, but he lifted a hand-lettered cardboard sign high above his head. It was written in permanent marker, the corners bent, the words shaky but bold. "Justice isn't dead. It just needed someone brave enough to stand." The crowd noticed. Cameras panned. A still shot of him, backlit by sunset, sign held aloft, went viral by midnight. It wasn't just an image. It was a symbol, an echo of everything this country had forgotten it could be. Jasmine saw the sign. She didn't say anything, but her lips pressed together in a small, silent acknowledgement. Not of herself, but of the truth behind those words. She had stood, and in doing so, she had pulled something back from the brink, not just for faith and family, but for every person who'd been steamrolled by a system designed to forget their names. By morning, the headlines weren't confined to national papers. They leapt oceans. The Guardian led with, U.S. federal judge arrested after legal showdown, led by Gen Z civil rights lawyer. Le Monde ran, États-Unis, une avocate de la Maison-Blanche fait tomber un juge corrompu. Der Spiegel's cover called it Das Gerechtigkeitserdbeben, the justice earthquake. Even Al Jazeera featured it in primetime. The narrative was simple but profound. One woman, one courtroom, one truth too heavy to bury. Back in Washington, the White House press briefing was packed wall to wall. When the president's press secretary stepped to the podium, the first question wasn't about inflation or international policy. It was about Jasmine Crockett. Will the administration support a full-scale investigation into the Liberty Fund network? One reporter asked. Another followed, was Ms. Crockett acting under direct orders? The spokesperson didn't flinch. Ms. Crockett followed the law, he said. What she uncovered speaks for itself. And yes, this administration supports every effort to root out corruption wherever it hides. Meanwhile, in communities across America, something stirred. Churches that had partnered with the Faith and Family Foundation rang their bells. Youth groups played Jasmine's speech during evening meetings. In Dallas, a group of law students marched silently across campus, holding candles and signs that read, "Honor the Truth." In Minneapolis, a middle school civics teacher scrapped her lesson plan to show her students Jasmine's courtroom moment, saying simply, "This is what justice looks like." It wasn't politics, it was principle. It was a reminder that the courtroom, long seen as a cold chamber of delay and disappointment, could still burn with fire when the right voice entered. But behind all the noise, behind the clips and tweets and headlines, stood Jasmine herself. She returned to the courthouse later that evening, long after the cameras had left. The steps were empty now. The marble glowed amber in the dying light. She stood at the bottom for a moment, then walked up slowly, her heels echoing like memories in the silence. At the top, she looked at the doors, closed now, guarded only by 2 posted officers and the ghosts of what had happened inside. She didn't knock. She didn't go in. She simply looked up at the sky, exhaled deeply, and whispered something no microphone could hear. Maybe a prayer, maybe a promise, maybe both. She had won the battle, but the war was still coming. Inside the building, agents were still reviewing Carter's files. Already, 3 more names from his network had triggered federal audits. Judges in Missouri, Arizona, and North Carolina had suddenly canceled public appearances. One had lawyered up. The others issued vague denials. But Jasmine knew better. She'd seen what fear looked like. She'd watched it unravel a man who once believed he was invincible, and she was ready to watch it happen again. Her phone buzzed. A message from Agent Morris. 1 line. "We just found another list." She stared at it for a long moment, then replied, "Send it over. We're not done." And then she walked down those steps again, into the night, into history, into whatever storm would come next. Because in a world that had forgotten how to fight for what was right, Jasmine Crockett didn't just remember. She led the way. Jasmine stepped onto the porch, each footstep echoing softly against the wooden boards, her heart still racing as if she were walking away from the battlefield rather than returning home. The night's quiet calm felt foreign after the day's relentless storm of truths and confrontations. She paused at the door, breathing deeply, allowing herself a fleeting moment to gather her composure. The cool air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass, mingling gently with the comforting aroma of dinner simmering inside. She reached for the doorknob, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. Residual adrenaline from the fierce battle she'd just waged inside the halls of justice. The door opened smoothly, the soft creak of hinges giving way to the warm, amber glow of her home's interior. Standing there was her husband, framed in gentle lamplight, his eyes glowing with pride, admiration, and a quiet, fierce respect. He said nothing at first. Words weren't necessary at this moment. Instead, he stepped forward, drawing her into a firm embrace. His arms enveloped her in a strength that spoke louder than any words could. He had watched her fight, witnessed her bravery, and understood exactly what her victory had cost her. "You were incredible," he finally whispered, his voice low, rich with emotion. "Every single word, every piece of evidence. You showed everyone what real courage looks like. I've never been more proud of you." Jasmine closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to feel the quiet strength of his support, the reassuring warmth of his pride filling the spaces that exhaustion had hollowed out inside her. Before she could respond, quick, eager footsteps sounded through the hallway, familiar and heartwarming. Her young daughter appeared, eyes wide with joyful innocence, her small face illuminated by the gentle smile Jasmine treasured above all else. Jasmine sank gracefully to her knees, holding her arms open wide. Her daughter rushed into her embrace, wrapping tiny arms around her mother's neck, squeezing tightly, as if sensing the weight Jasmine had carried that day. Holding her daughter close, Jasmine felt her heart steady, the tension within her slowly easing, replaced by profound clarity. She gently stroked her daughter's soft hair, whispering quietly yet firmly, "Mommy did the right thing today, sweetheart. Mommy stood up and made sure that truth still matters. But Mommy's job isn't finished yet, not by a long shot." The child nestled closer, sensing her mother's fierce determination even if she couldn't yet grasp the fullness of its meaning. Jasmine rose slowly, still holding her daughter tenderly in her arms, feeling the steady reassurance of her husband's gaze upon her. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. They both knew this victory was only the first in a much larger fight, a fight that would demand more strength, resilience, and courage than Jasmine had yet shown. But in that shared glance, there was an unspoken promise. Whatever came next, they would face it together, united and unbreakable. Jasmine moved further into their home, surrounded by warmth and love, yet acutely aware of the battles yet to come. But tonight, in this sacred, quiet moment, she allowed herself to draw strength from her family, from the profound love that anchored her. She felt her daughter's steady heartbeat against her chest, a reminder of why she had fought so fiercely today and why she would continue fighting, no matter the cost. Jasmine sat alone on the edge of the couch, the room wrapped in a hushed quiet only found after war. The glow of the floor lamp spilled gold across the floor, brushing against the framed family photos, the woven blanket folded neatly on the armchair, the quiet hum of the night that felt impossibly distant from the storm she had just walked through. Her daughter lay curled in her lap, breathing softly, one hand still fisted gently in the fabric of Jasmine's blazer. Small fingers that had no idea they were clinging to a woman who had just ripped the veil off a corrupt machine. The phone buzzed next to her, again, then again. Notifications poured in like a flash flood. News headlines, trending hashtags, shares, direct messages from strangers and allies and enemies alike. But Jasmine didn't look at the screen yet. Her eyes were fixed on her daughter's face. So small, so peaceful. A piece of her own heart lying there without fear, without pain. For a moment, Jasmine simply held her close, pressing her lips to her temple, breathing in the warm, innocent scent of safety, of home. Then slowly, she reached for her phone. She unlocked the screen and was immediately met with a digital storm. Every major network had picked up the footage. Carter in handcuffs, the courtroom erupting, Jasmine standing tall while the most powerful man in that building unraveled like cheap thread. Clips of her reading aloud Carter's incriminating emails had gone viral, stitched with the words, "This is what courage looks like." But Jasmine didn't get lost in the applause. She opened the Post editor and stared at the blinking cursor. Her fingers began to move, not from adrenaline, but from resolve. Each word struck with the weight of purpose. She typed, "Today was just the first step. We won't stop until justice is fully restored." Then she hit send. The post shot out into the world like a flare into a sky filled with watchful eyes. Thousands began to repost it within seconds. People were hungry for something that felt real, something that felt righteous. But Jasmine wasn't watching the shares or the likes. She was watching her daughter, still asleep, one foot twitching in a dream. And in that moment, Jasmine heard the thought rise inside her. Not loud, not cinematic, but sharp and cold as truth. "I cannot let you grow up in a country where justice is bought." She stared at her daughter for a long moment, heart tight. "You deserve better," she whispered, "so much better." She stood slowly, carrying her little girl to her room, placing her gently in bed, brushing soft curls from her forehead. Then she returned to the living room where her husband was waiting. He handed her a glass of water without a word. She took a sip, sat down beside him, their shoulders touching. "They're going to come after me," she said quietly. He didn't blink. "Let them," he replied. "You already showed them you're not afraid." She looked down at her phone again. Messages were pouring in. People she hadn't heard from in years. Survivors of corrupted trials. Whistleblowers, anonymous tips. One message stood out. It was from a young public defender in Ohio. "I saw something similar happen with Judge number 4 on that list. I have transcripts. If you need help building the case, I'm in." Jasmine replied immediately. "Send everything." "We're not done." She turned to her husband. "We'll need a team. Lawyers, journalists, data analysts. This is bigger than Carter." He nodded. "I've already started a list." She smiled faintly. "Of course you have." Another message came in. An invitation to speak on national television. Another from a nonprofit offering to help fund independent investigations. Another from a journalist in London asking if Jasmine believed the corruption reached international donors. She didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she set the phone down, leaned back, closed her eyes for a moment. Tomorrow would come fast. And with it, retaliation, smear campaigns, threats, legal maneuvers from those who wanted the truth to stay buried. She would be called a liar, a radical, a disruptor. But Jasmine didn't fear that anymore, because today she had walked into a courtroom built to silence her, and she had made it listen. And because tonight her daughter was sleeping soundly in a home where truth was protected, because now the whole world was watching, and she would not stop. The aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's courtroom stand rippled far beyond the federal building where it began. What started as a hearing on one charity's reputation exploded into a nationwide reckoning. But beneath the headlines, the hashtags, and the cheers of victory lay a deeper question, the kind that echoed long after the crowd had dispersed and the cameras had powered down. What does it cost to stand alone against a broken system? And what do we owe to the truth when silence is safer? This story was never just about a corrupt judge. It was about the quiet rot of unchecked power, the way influence seeps behind closed doors, how justice is quietly strangled under the weight of money, favoritism, and fear. Jasmine didn't simply confront a man in robes. She confronted a machine designed to shield itself from scrutiny, to punish those who asked the wrong questions, and to grind down anyone who dared to fight it with nothing but truth in their hands. Most people would have folded. Many had, for decades. But Jasmine didn't. She stood her ground while a man with federal power bellowed threats, tried to publicly humiliate her, and nearly had her dragged from the courtroom in contempt. She endured laughter from the gallery, the condescension of men twice her age, in the whisper of doubt from the supposed allies. She was called a puppet, a liar, a little girl who didn't know the law. She was told to sit down, to be quiet, to remember her place, and she answered them with evidence. She didn't scream. She didn't retaliate in anger. She flipped page after page of cold, irrefutable facts, bank statements, emails, timestamps, until the weight of the truth crushed the arrogance in that room. And when they accused her of fabrication, when they tried to discredit her, she reached into her pocket and pressed play. Her enemy's voice, ordering the destruction of justice, filled the air like a confession from hell itself. That moment wasn't just a courtroom climax. It was a mirror, forcing every witness, every viewer, every American to confront the uncomfortable truth. Justice is not self-sustaining. It does not defend itself. And it is not immune to corruption simply because it wears a robe or hangs a flag behind its desk. Justice lives or dies by the people who are willing to bleed for it. That's the lesson. You don't need a badge or a bench to demand truth. You need courage. You need resilience. You need the kind of spine that doesn't crumble when power threatens to crush you. Jasmine Crockett wasn't backed by a political machine. She wasn't protected by rank or entitlement. She walked into that courtroom as a black woman, a civil rights lawyer, a mother, and a citizen, and she dared to hold the line. And because she did, one of the most protected men in the judicial system fell. Because she did, a movement began. This story reminds us that injustice doesn't always look like a violent crime. Sometimes it wears a suit, it signs documents, it deletes files, it smiles in photographs and delivers rulings that quietly destroy lives. That kind of injustice is the most dangerous because it cloaks itself in legitimacy. It hides in plain sight in systems that most of us are taught to trust without question. But when one person breaks that silence, when one voice refuses to be buried, it becomes a crack in the facade. That crack spreads. It reaches jurors. It reaches whistleblowers. It reaches journalists and janitors and clerks and students. And before long, what once seemed untouchable begins to crumble. Jasmine Crockett's stand didn't just topple a man. It exposed a network. It opened doors that had been sealed shut by fear and silence. It forced a nation to ask, how many others are hiding in those robes? How many verdicts were bought? How many lives were destroyed by greed pretending to be justice? That's the human cost. And that's why Jasmine's stand matters. Because this isn't fiction. It isn't just a compelling headline or a courtroom drama. It's a reflection of the world we live in. A world where too often the powerful assume they are immune to consequence, where truth is treated like a nuisance, and where silence is weaponized as complicity. But Jasmine didn't stay silent. She reminded us that every time someone speaks truth in a room designed to suppress it, the system shudders. Every time someone refuses to be intimidated, the corrupt lose a little more ground. And every time someone says enough, justice claws its way back from the shadows. The lesson isn't that Jasmine was brave. The lesson is that bravery is contagious. Her stand didn't end when the gavel fell or when Carter was led away in cuffs. It ignited something larger, an awakening in the hearts of those who'd stopped believing change was possible. It taught us that you don't need permission to do what's right, that dignity can withstand ridicule, that truth, when spoken clearly and backed by evidence, is stronger than any threat. And most of all, it showed us that justice is not a relic. It is not dead. It just needs someone brave enough to stand up and drag it back into the light. Even if they stand alone, especially if they stand alone. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In just 72 hours, the entire nation was shaken by a high-stakes federal trial between Jasmine Crockett, the White House attorney, and the cunning reporter, Maya Reynolds. Under the courtroom lights, each accusation tightened the hearts of millions. Who was telling the truth, and who was staging a performance? Even more disturbing, Judge Harrison, the one meant to uphold justice, kept interrupting Jasmine and repeating, "The press is the fourth branch of power." But can you guess the one moment that left even him speechless and brought the entire courtroom to a breathless standstill? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The storm had been gathering for weeks, on headlines, on social media, and in the war rooms of partisan networks. Now it had a location, a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., transformed overnight into a national battleground. Reporters from every major outlet flooded the courthouse steps. Satellite trucks lined the block. Inside, the pews groaned under the weight of press badges and camera crews, all broadcasting live to millions. The plaintiff? Maya Reynolds, a viral liberal journalist, known more for dramatic monologues than investigative integrity. She had filed suit against Jasmine Crockett, claiming that the White House attorney had violated her First Amendment rights by removing her from a congressional hearing after a combative exchange. The lawsuit, thin on legal substance but thick with theatrics, was instantly weaponized by mainstream networks. They dubbed it the trial of free speech. Talking heads speculated, commentators postured, but one truth cut through the noise. This wasn't about free speech. This was about control. And yet, in the midst of a legal firestorm, Jasmine made a decision that stunned the legal community. She would represent herself. No legal team, no PR handlers, just her. When asked why, her response was simple but thunderous. No one can defend the truth better than the one who stands in it. It wasn't just confidence. It was war cry. Judges frowned, journalists scoffed. Maya's legal counsel smirked, but Jasmine didn't flinch. Her every step down the courtroom aisle echoed like a drumbeat. This wasn't just another trial. It was the collision of truth and illusion. And Jasmine was walking straight into the storm, not to survive it, but to end it. The courtroom lights seemed to dim, not literally but figuratively, the moment Maya Reynolds took the stand. There was a subtle shift in the air, the kind you feel right before a storm breaks. She walked with slow, deliberate steps, wearing a cream-colored blazer, modest makeup, and just enough fatigue in her eyes to suggest a woman who had been deeply wronged. A sympathetic sigh rippled through the gallery even before she said a word. She adjusted the microphone with a delicate touch, then glanced briefly at the jury with wide, glassy eyes that shimmered under the courtroom lights. Every movement felt deliberate, choreographed to perfection. This wasn't a testimony, it was an entrance. When she began to speak, her voice was soft, almost fragile. She started with how she had always respected institutions, how she'd admired the courage it takes to speak truth to power. She told the jury she was just doing her job the day Jasmine Crockett had her removed from the hearing room. Her voice cracked, perfectly timed, as she described the moment when security walked toward me like I was a threat, like I didn't belong. She took a shallow breath, just audible enough for the microphones to catch. All I did, she said, was ask a question. One question, for the American people. Her lawyer remained still beside her, as if even he knew the moment didn't need help. Maya didn't break eye contact with the jury. And for that, she said, I was humiliated on national television. My name was dragged through political blogs. My inbox flooded with death threats, all because I asked why. At the perfect moment, the courtroom monitor flickered on. Maya's legal team had cued a carefully edited video, just under a minute long. It opened with Maya seated calmly, pen resting softly in her hand, face neutral. Jasmine could be seen speaking, then gesturing to a security officer. The clip ended as Maya was quietly escorted out, her eyes cast downward, her expression stunned, angelic even. The audio was muted. No interruptions, no repetitive questioning, no rising voice, no tension. It was a sanitized, emotional sucker punch. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. From the way the jurors leaned forward, from the hushed murmurs of the press bench, it was clear. They had just seen the story Maya wanted them to see. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless at the defense table, watching every second with razor-sharp focus. But inside, she could feel it, the spin working, the trap springing shut. This wasn't evidence. It was framing. It was crafted to play on the hearts of people who weren't in the room that day, who didn't hear Maya's tone, didn't see the interruptions, didn't feel the tension bleeding out of every minute she dominated the floor. Maya's eyes glossed again as the lights came back up. She dabbed a tissue under her lashes, then turned slightly in the witness chair. Not enough to be dramatic, just enough to show vulnerability. The jury noticed, the cameras noticed, and Jasmine knew. The headlines were already writing themselves. Journalists silenced, truth on trial. The judge cleared his throat, leaning slightly forward as Maya stepped down from the stand. "Thank you, Miss Reynolds," he said with a softness not yet heard in the courtroom. "It takes courage to speak out when it's easier to stay silent. Let the record show your composure has been exemplary." He gave her a brief nod, almost paternal. A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the gallery. Jasmine Crockett, seated alone at the defense table, absorbed every word. Not just Maya's, but the judge's too. This wasn't neutrality. It was alignment. And she was no longer just defending herself. She was fighting a room already leaning against her. The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped toward the podium, the air in the courtroom shifted, but not in her favor. The energy was off, tilted, like walking into a room where a decision had already been made behind closed doors. She adjusted the microphone, laid out her documents, hearing transcripts, procedural codes, hard evidence. But from the first word out of her mouth, it was clear. This wasn't going to be a fair exchange. "Members of the jury," Jasmine began calmly, "before any conclusions are drawn, I urge you to examine not just the emotion, but the procedure." Ms. Reynolds was not removed for asking a question. She was removed after repeatedly. "Ms. Crockett," the judge interjected abruptly, his tone edged with quiet warning. "You are not here to relitigate the hearing. Please stick to the relevant legal arguments." Jasmine didn't flinch. She nodded slightly, then continued. "The legal argument is the hearing, Your Honor. The removal occurred because of a clear pattern of disruption, which is outlined." "You've made that point," the judge snapped, cutting her off a second time. His gaze shifted briefly toward the jury before continuing, this time with a tone more reflective, almost paternal. "Let us not forget," he said, pausing for weight, "that the press is often referred to as the Fourth Estate, an essential pillar of our democracy. They are not above scrutiny, but they must never be silenced. History has shown us what happens when the press is pushed out of the room." The words weren't addressed to Jasmine, but they landed on her like a gavel. Her hands gripped the edge of the podium. The implication was crystal clear and publicly delivered. Maya, sitting beside her counsel, lowered her eyes just enough to seem modest. The cameras captured it all. A juror nodded faintly. Another leaned back, arms crossed. A few whispered pens began scribbling. Jasmine opened her mouth to respond, but stopped. She could push back, but what would that look like? Combative? Defensive? Disrespectful? That was the game now. She wasn't just being challenged on evidence. She was being boxed into a role, the harsh government enforcer against a helpless journalist. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so strategically devastating. This wasn't just bias, it was alignment. The judge wasn't an umpire. He was nudging the bat toward one side. And Jasmine Crockett, who had spent her career defending rule of law, was now being denied the right to finish a sentence. The judge's words still echoed in the courtroom when the real trial, the one outside, roared to life. No sooner had Jasmine Crockett returned to her seat than the headlines began to flood in like a rising tide. The press gallery had barely closed their laptops before the internet ignited. Push notifications lit up phones across the country. Breaking: White House attorney accused of silencing the press. Live journalist testifies against government censorship. Photos of Maya's tearful expression and the judge's quote about the Fourth Estate dominated front pages. Cropped frames. No context. Just a neatly packaged story. David versus Goliath, truth versus authority. Within an hour, hashtags like "Shushun Press Freedom" and "Silence by Power" were trending on X and TikTok, fueled by influencers and pundits who hadn't watched more than 30 seconds of courtroom footage. Cable news ran with it, spinning panel after panel like roulette wheels of outrage. On one channel, a talking head declared, "This is a chilling escalation. We now have top government attorneys removing reporters from the room. What's next?" Another segment aired with a bold red chyron. "Jasmine Crockett, tough defender or Democratic threat?" The tone wasn't inquiry, it was judgment. Even neutral outlets carried headlines laced with doubt. Firm or frightening, Jasmine Crockett's courtroom conduct under scrutiny. And every segment, every soundbite, leaned into the same unspoken message. She overstepped. She's hiding something. And maybe, just maybe, she enjoyed it. The media storm outside was relentless. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done fighting. Not in court, and certainly not with the truth. As the prosecution rested, the courtroom braced for her rebuttal. She walked to the center of the courtroom with the calm of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, though she also knew, deep down, that what she was about to say would be judged through a lens already fogged by bias. Still, she stood tall. Because that's what you do when the system pushes back. You push harder, but smarter. This, Jasmine said, holding the binder slightly above the podium, is the official Congressional Media Access Protocol. It's not a suggestion. It's not a formality. It's the rule book. And it's the same for every journalist, every hearing, every session, no matter who's in the room. Her voice was clear, steady, and carried no trace of anger, only clarity. She opened the binder and turned slowly, deliberately, to a highlighted section. Section 2.3 states, members of the press shall be granted the opportunity to ask questions at the discretion of the chair, provided such participation does not obstruct the orderly conduct of proceedings. That's the law. That's what we're here to defend. She looked up at the jury, pausing just long enough for the silence to land. Let's talk about what actually happened that day, she said, flipping to another page, this one tagged with red. Ms. Reynolds was not silenced. She was not dismissed for asking a question. She was warned 3 times on the record, not because of what she asked, but how she asked it. She interrupted speakers. She ignored transitions. She asked the same highly charged question 5 times in a row, refusing to yield even when other reporters had been waiting. That is not journalism. That is disruption. She leaned forward slightly now, not as a threat, but as a woman who had been forced into this position by lies that gained traction before the truth could even get to its feet. The first warning came at timestamp 10:32, she said, glancing at her notes. I said, quote, Ms. Reynolds, that question has been addressed. Please allow others a chance to speak, she continued. Jasmine turned a page. The second warning came at 10:36. We're moving on unless there's a new question. Again ignored. And at 10:39, the final warning. If the disruption continues, we will have no choice but to ask you to leave. Jasmine looked up again, her voice steady but now lined with steel. At no point did she attempt to comply, because compliance wasn't the goal. Confrontation was. She could feel the shift in the room, not a full reversal, but an unease. Some jurors avoided eye contact. One leaned in, as if seeing something new for the first time. But Jasmine didn't press for emotion. She pressed for understanding. This wasn't an impulsive reaction. It wasn't a personal attack. It was a measured, procedural response, guided by law, reinforced by policy, and backed by every ounce of restraint I had as a professional sworn to uphold institutional integrity. Then more quietly, but with deeper resonance, she said, I am not on trial for being reckless. I'm here because I refuse to let a circus take over a chamber meant for lawmaking. If that makes me difficult, if that makes me harsh, then so be it. But it also makes me honest. And that still matters. The room was still. Not because everyone agreed, but because, for the first time in hours, something undeniable had entered the room. Structure, facts, boundaries, no performance, no emotion. Just a woman who had the receipts and the courage to read them aloud. She had just laid out the facts, clear, chronological, irrefutable. 3 verbal warnings, 5 repeated disruptions. Every word grounded in official record, not opinion. But the moment her voice carried even the faintest edge of conviction, the courtroom's balance shifted again. Not because of evidence, but because of tone. The judge leaned forward, his hand raised with a subtle authority that needed no gavel. His voice cut cleanly through Jasmine's momentum like a wire through glass. Ms. Crockett, he said with a calm that felt colder than fury, please refrain from inserting personal sentiment into your statements. Let's keep emotion out of the legal argument. There was a pause, not dramatic, but deafening. A few jurors glanced up. One reporter in the gallery stifled a smirk. The comment had landed exactly as intended, not just as a correction, but a public scolding. Jasmine had not raised her voice. She had not wept. She had simply spoken firmly. But when it came from her, a black woman standing alone at the defense table, challenging the accepted narrative, it became too emotional. It always did. And now the judge had handed the room permission to dismiss her strength as sentiment. Jasmine didn't snap back. She didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly straightened her shoulders and tilted her head upward, her gaze moving toward the ceiling of the chamber. Her eyes lingered there, not to stall, but to center herself. Above her, carved into the dark wood and stone, were the same Latin words etched into nearly every courtroom across the country. Fiat justitia ruat caelum. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. She took a breath. Then she lowered her gaze, not to the judge, not to the plaintiff, but directly to the jury. And when she spoke, her voice was lower, steadier, and clearer than ever. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said, her tone edged in steel but never defiant, what you call emotion, I call experience. The courtroom held still. I've spent over a decade defending members of the press, she continued, her hands no longer gripping the podium, but open and firm. Not in air-conditioned hearing rooms, not in places with cameras and hashtags and pre-written scripts. I've defended journalists in places where one question can get you blackbagged in the middle of the night, in courtrooms where there is no jury, no press gallery, no appeals. Her eyes were sharp now, not pleading, but unforgiving. Cairo, Caracas, Istanbul, you name it. I've stood in those rooms, arguing for the rights of reporters who risk their lives for the truth. She let the weight of that settle before going on. So no, I'm not emotional. I'm not speaking out of turn. I'm telling you that I know exactly what press freedom looks like when it's real, and I also know what it looks like when it's abused. She turned a single page in the binder in front of her, slowly. Freedom of the press does not mean freedom to dominate the room. It does not mean freedom to interrupt 5 times and call it bravery. It does not mean staging a confrontation for the cameras, then crying foul when accountability arrives. Then quieter but with more force than anything said before. Freedom does not include the right to destroy the truth in pursuit of spectacle. The room fell utterly silent. No shuffling papers, no whispering pens. Even the judge for a beat seemed to hesitate, his mouth slightly open, as if he'd intended to speak but thought better of it. Jasmine's words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a recalibration of the entire narrative. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made it personal. She had simply pulled the curtain back and left the court staring into the light. In that moment, it didn't matter whether people agreed with her politics. It didn't matter how the cameras would edit the footage or which headline would spin first. What mattered, what everyone in that room felt, was that for the first time someone wasn't playing to the gallery. Jasmine wasn't performing. She was standing. And no one in that room, not even the judge, could pretend otherwise. The courtroom still hadn't recovered from Jasmine's last statement, but she wasn't interested in recovery. She was interested in revelation. And now it was time to bring the truth out from under the weight of spin, bias, and carefully rehearsed victimhood. She reached down, picked up a slim flash drive from her briefcase, and held it up, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a final play rooted in fact. Her voice was calm, but unmistakably loaded with purpose. Your Honor, she said, her voice level, I request permission to present supplemental video evidence, unedited, taken from the internal fixed camera used by the House Security Office, positioned behind the press gallery. It includes both audio and video. This feed is not public. It has not been aired. There was a pause. The judge shifted slightly in his chair. This wasn't part of the prosecution's script, and it showed. Still, his voice came forward with a touch of caution. You may proceed. The bailiff moved quickly. The lights dimmed. A hush swept across the room, not from respect, but from the instinctive tension of people sensing something irreversible was about to happen. Then the screen flickered to life. It wasn't a dramatic angle. No zooms, no focus pulls. Just a wide, flat security shot from the back wall of the hearing room. There sat Maya Reynolds, front row, clearly visible. The sound quality was dry and clinical. The room and the footage felt ordinary, but what played on that screen was anything but. Maya raised her hand. Jasmine, at the podium, called on her. The first question came, a loaded one, but still within bounds. Jasmine responded. Then Maya raised her hand again. The same question with different phrasing. Jasmine answered again, more firmly this time. A third time. Then a fourth, cutting off another reporter in the process. Jasmine in the background clearly said, Ms. Reynolds, I've answered that already. We're moving forward. The fifth time was different. Maya's body leaned forward in her seat, both hands planted on the table in front of her. She spoke more forcefully, this time not even waiting to be called on. The footage captured Jasmine trying to redirect, then calmly saying, Final warning, Ms. Reynolds. If you continue, I will have to ask you to leave. But the real moment, the moment the room wasn't ready for, came right after that. The camera, with its wider field of view, captured Maya leaning ever so slightly to the side. She didn't know her voice would carry, but it did. That's it, she whispered, lips barely moving. I've got my headline. I just need her to kick me out now. The room froze, not in shock, but in slow, dawning recognition. There were no gasps, no outbursts, just a thick, charged silence. One juror turned their head toward the screen slowly, as if their brain couldn't keep up with what their ears had just confirmed. Another blinked, hard. The defense table remained motionless. Jasmine stood still, arms at her sides, shoulders relaxed. She didn't need to add anything, because the tape had already said everything. And then all eyes turned, not to Jasmine, not to the judge, but to Maya Reynolds. She hadn't moved, but her face had changed. Her posture, once assertive and perfectly posed, now seemed tighter, shoulders pulled in, lips pressed flat. Her eyes didn't meet the jury. They stayed on the desk in front of her, fixated on a single point that wasn't there. The flush that rose to her cheeks wasn't the kind born of righteous anger. It was the kind that came when the performance had ended, but the lights were still on. She blinked rapidly, like someone trying to reset, then shifted uncomfortably in her chair. For a brief second, she reached for her pen, then set it back down. The theater had ended. The mask had cracked, and she knew it. But she didn't speak. What could she possibly say? The footage continued, Maya being removed by security, calmly, respectfully. She didn't resist. She didn't argue. She walked out with a smirk just barely tugging at the corner of her mouth. And then the screen faded to black. No commentary, no final note, just silence. When the lights came back on, it was as if the air had changed density. Reporters sat frozen. Jurors sat stiff-backed. The gallery, previously so alive with murmurs and judgment, now seemed stunned into stillness. At the bench, the judge said nothing. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. His fingers adjusted the collar of his robe. But the words didn't come. For the first time in this trial, he had none. Then came a sound, soft, low, and entirely unexpected. From the far end of the jury box, an older man leaned forward slightly. He didn't speak to the room. He didn't grandstand. He just whispered, mostly to himself, but loud enough to be heard by the people nearest him. This isn't journalism, he said. This is theater. The quote hung there like smoke, and suddenly everyone in the courtroom saw it, the shape of the truth, plain as day. Maya's story hadn't unraveled. It had collapsed. And in its place stood only a camera angle, a whisper, and the one woman in the room who had refused to be intimidated by performance. The courtroom, once crackling with opinion and tension, now sat blanketed in an eerie quiet. The footage had done what no argument, no transcript, no witness statement could. It sliced through the noise. And though no one said it aloud, the room understood that something had shifted irreversibly. The judge adjusted his robe with deliberate slowness, as if the weight of the bench had suddenly become too heavy. He cleared his throat, not to assert authority, but to buy time. Then finally his voice returned, quieter, flatter, stripped of the quiet edge it had once carried. Given the emergence of new video evidence, he said, carefully avoiding eye contact with Jasmine or the jury, this court will delay further proceedings pending review. The court is adjourned until further notice. He tapped the gavel once, lightly like it might break if struck too hard. The tone of finality wasn't there. There was no victory in his voice, no closure, just bureaucracy masking retreat. Jasmine didn't move, not immediately. She let the silence linger, watching the judge exit through the back door, like a man who'd suddenly realized the script he'd followed had fallen apart in his hands. Maya still sat at the plaintiff's table, frozen, not in disbelief, but in calculation. Her eyes were forward, unblinking, as if hoping that stillness might slow the unraveling. But the room around her had already moved on. Outside, the world was waiting. A battalion of cameras lined the courthouse steps, reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, all poised to catch the first word, the first misstep. As Jasmine pushed through the heavy oak doors, a wall of flashes exploded in her face, lightning strikes of curated chaos. The noise was deafening, names shouted from every angle, questions overlapping like falling dominoes. She had walked out of courtrooms before, but never like this. Never into a storm built entirely on someone else's lie. Ms. Crockett, do you think the video changes the narrative? Is Maya Reynolds a fraud, yes or no? What do you say to those who claim you're attacking press freedom? And then, cutting through the noise like a sharp blade from the back of the pack, came one question, perfectly timed, perfectly weighted. Do you regret removing a journalist from the room, Ms. Crockett? Do you feel any remorse for silencing the press? Jasmine stopped mid-step. The sound of shutters slowed. The crowd shifted forward instinctively. Reporters leaned in, arms outstretched, mics pointed like weapons. It was the question they'd built the entire spectacle around, and now they wanted to see if she'd blink. She didn't. Instead, she turned, calm, precise, controlled, and faced the chaos head-on. She didn't scan for the source of the question. She looked straight into the nearest lens, as if she already knew it was live. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it was devastatingly clear. I didn't remove a journalist, she said. I refuse to be used as a prop in someone else's performance. The words landed like a thunderclap in a glass room. Reporters who had been shouting went silent. A few lowered their microphones slowly. One cameraman blinked, not because of the light, but because he knew the clip was already gold. Her tone hadn't shifted into anger. She wasn't defending. She was defining. Jasmine held the camera's gaze for just a second more. Then she turned away, not in retreat, but in refusal. Refusal to play a part in the farce that had been designed to swallow her. Behind her, the press corps stood still, the noise temporarily stunned into submission. As she descended the courthouse steps, her phone buzzed nonstop in her pocket. Texts, alerts, missed calls from colleagues, allies, enemies, and more than a few reporters who were suddenly interested in correcting the record. But she didn't reach for it. Not yet. The performance was over. The curtain had dropped. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't the villain they had hoped she'd be. She was the one who hadn't blinked, the one who didn't fold, the one who turned a spotlight back onto the game and walked through it untouched. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was anxious, but because she knew the truth was finally in her hands and she wasn't about to let it wait another second. There was no war room, no team of strategists, just Jasmine Crockett, alone in her living room, the glare of the laptop screen lighting her face. The full footage, the one that shattered Maya's version of events, had already been admitted in court. But court was no longer the battlefield. The real fight was out there, in living rooms, news feeds, and comment threads where headlines move faster than facts. So she uploaded it. No cuts, no commentary, no dramatic piano music or animated arrows. Just 13 minutes and 22 seconds of cold, steady footage from the internal security camera. Start to finish. It showed Maya asking the same question 5 times. It showed her talking over other reporters. It showed her smirking after being warned. It captured the moment she leaned to the side and whispered, clear as day, "That's it. I've got my headline. I just need her to kick me out now." Jasmine didn't narrate it. She didn't need to. Instead, she posted it with a single line of text. No commentary needed. Just watch the whole thing. It dropped like a silent grenade. Within 20 minutes, the views crossed 100,000, then 500,000, then 1 million. Independent creators started breaking it down frame by frame. Side-by-side comparisons flooded TikTok and YouTube. On the left, Maya's clipped version, slow-zoomed and dramatized. On the right, the raw truth. People were stunned, not by Jasmine's restraint, but by how convincingly the public had been manipulated. Twitter, now X, lit up like a Christmas tree. The phrase #watch the whole tape trended in multiple countries. It wasn't just a hashtag, it was a rallying cry. Users began tagging news anchors, editors, and verified influencers who had piled on Jasmine days earlier. You owe her an apology. This is why people don't trust the media. She didn't silence anyone. She stopped a staged takedown. Screenshots surfaced of old posts quoting Maya's accusations, now edited or deleted. But the internet never forgets, and it doesn't forgive quickly. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't retweet. She didn't comment. She just watched as the tide for once turned, not because someone yelled louder, but because someone told the truth and walked away. Then came the first real crack in the wall. The Sentinel, a widely respected center-left publication known for balanced reporting, issued a statement on its homepage. Not in fine print, not buried behind a paywall. Front and center. Bold headline, "We got it wrong." The article didn't hide behind technicalities. It opened with a sentence that hadn't been written in American journalism in years. "We relied on selectively edited footage and failed to verify the full context before publication." They admitted it. They called Maya's version incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. And then came the line Jasmine read twice to make sure it was real. "We apologize to attorney Jasmine Crockett for misrepresenting her actions and contributing to the erosion of public trust." Jasmine sat back in her chair, eyes still fixed on the screen. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply exhaled, slowly, deeply, like a soldier who'd been holding her breath through the crossfire. This wasn't vindication. It was restoration. In that moment, the story wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger, about how easily lies spread and how rare it was for truth to catch up. But tonight it had, not because it shouted, not because it demanded sympathy, but because it stood still while everything else spun around it and refused to blink. And somewhere out there, Maya Reynolds was watching the same clip Jasmine had posted. But this time, she wasn't the protagonist. She was the playback. In the days following Jasmine Crockett's explosive video release, the once rising star Maya Reynolds found herself thrust into the harshest spotlight imaginable. Not as a champion of truth, but as a cautionary tale for everyone who dared to manipulate facts under the guise of journalistic integrity. Veteran reporters, who had once begrudgingly admired her flair for dramatic coverage, now denounced her tactics as corrosive to the very principles they had spent their careers defending, with some going so far as to liken her methods to tabloid sensationalism dressed up in political activism. One respected journalist from a major network delivered a scathing op-ed, condemning Maya's calculated push for a viral confrontation as a betrayal of the public's trust, and lamenting that her deceit would likely cast a lingering shadow on legitimate reporters striving to uncover real corruption and hold power accountable. Within a week, social media accounts that had once championed her courage pivoted sharply, calling her a fraud and an opportunist, while thousands of viewers flooded comment sections demanding she step away from the limelight to atone for weaponizing their genuine concern into a theatrical ploy for personal gain. Perhaps the most damning blow came when the national newspaper she had once freelanced for publicly suspended all collaboration with her, citing gross ethical violations and releasing a formal statement that declared, in no uncertain terms, that Maya's actions had endangered the very concept of press credibility. From op-ed pages to primetime news panels, a swift consensus formed that her orchestrated encounter with Jasmine had crossed the line from aggressive reporting into theatrical manipulation, a line that decades of honest journalism had fought to keep intact, and a line Maya had brazenly ignored. Watching it all unfold from afar, Jasmine received word after word of quiet support, emails from longtime journalists who felt betrayed by Maya's grandstanding, private messages from editors who acknowledged they'd fumbled the story out of haste, and even calls from networks wanting exclusive interviews to set the record straight. Yet Jasmine understood that the damage inflicted on legitimate press efforts wouldn't vanish overnight, because every sensational lie only made the public more cynical, and every cynic looked at real journalists with the same mistrust they now reserved for Maya, one of their own who had torched her credibility for a headline. Even so, the collective condemnation of Maya's fabricated crusade sent a powerful message that no matter how enticing viral fame appeared, no matter how many clicks or views were at stake, true journalism would hold itself accountable and reject those who chose spectacle over substance, especially when entire reputations were on the line. So while Maya Reynolds now found herself shut out of editorial meetings and unfollowed by countless industry peers who saw her betrayal as poison in the well of public trust, Jasmine Crockett pressed forward, resolute and absolutely uncompromised, quietly reminding the world that even in a maelstrom of spin and deception, undeniable truth still carried its own quiet, unbreakable power and unwavering grace. For 3 full days, the jury deliberated behind closed doors, each hour dripping with uncertainty like a slow leak in a dam. Rumors swirled in the press about how long it was taking, some claiming the evidence against Maya Reynolds was too damning, others insisting that the court might be caving to public pressure. Tension radiated from every corner of the courthouse, so thick that even casual observers felt it cling to their skin the moment they walked inside. Reporters hovered by the doors, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone, anyone, who might give them an inside tip, but the jury stayed silent. Jasmine Crockett waited patiently, her composure outwardly intact, though she'd be lying if she said her nerves weren't buzzing beneath the surface. She had weathered so many twists and turns already. One more day, one more night, felt both trivial and monumental at the same time. Each passing moment reminded her that this case was no longer just about her or Maya. It was about the integrity of the press and the boundaries of fair inquiry in a democracy. Finally, on the morning of the 4th day, they announced the verdict would be read that afternoon. An electric hush swept through the corridors, and all eyes turned to Jasmine, who simply nodded and prepared herself for the final showdown. When the jury re-entered the courtroom, the tension inside felt heavier than any day prior, like a thunderstorm about to break. The bailiff called for silence, and even the usual rustling of notepads and low whispers died down to nothing. Maya sat at her table, shoulders stiff, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling, as though hoping for divine intervention. Across from her, Jasmine maintained the same quiet dignity that had characterized her throughout the trial. No dramatic sighs, no sudden glances, just calm readiness. The judge appeared through his chamber doors with a measured step, a file folder clutched in one hand. A faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead suggested even he was not immune to the gravity of this moment. Cameras positioned in the back captured every micro-expression, broadcasting to millions of viewers who had followed this case like a white-knuckled thriller. As the judge took his seat, he cleared his throat once, sharp and controlled, commanding the room's undivided attention. Without ceremony, he gave a single nod to the foreman, who rose to deliver the verdict. The foreman's voice wavered only slightly as he read the conclusion of their deliberations. The court found Maya's accusations without merit, dismissing every claim that Jasmine had unlawfully silenced a legitimate journalist. The official statement acknowledged that Jasmine had acted within her authority during the hearing in question, enforcing procedural rules that Maya repeatedly violated. As the foreman continued, a ripple seemed to pass across the gallery, relief for some, disbelief for others. Finally, the judge lifted his gaze, eyes sweeping the room before delivering the line that would be quoted by every news outlet from coast to coast. Justice does not serve emotion, it serves truth. Even Maya, who had tried so hard to frame this as a battle of feelings, blinked at the starkness of that phrase. In one swift stroke, the judicial gavel had shattered her narrative that Jasmine was motivated by malice or personal vendetta. The judge then paused, letting the weight of his words settle in, and announced that all charges against Jasmine Crockett were officially dismissed. There was no dramatic applause at first, only an overwhelmed silence, as if the courtroom needed a moment to catch its collective breath. Outside, however, the hush was short-lived. Reporters jostled with renewed fervor, desperate to be the first to transmit this momentous ending. Maya's face was unreadable for a second, a forced neutrality masking a chaotic storm beneath, and then her posture slumped ever so slightly. She exhaled in a long, defeated breath, as though releasing the last ounce of fight she had carried into the courtroom. With the verdict clear, her chance at controlling the narrative vanished, and so too did the air of theatrical righteousness she once wore so proudly. On the other side, Jasmine remained composed, only allowing herself a single calm inhale before she began to gather her things. She looked neither triumphant nor smug. She simply looked resolved, like a person who had weathered the worst of a storm and come out standing. Cameras flashed wildly, turning the moment into a staccato of white lights, freeze-framing the exact second Maya's accusations collapsed in on themselves. The judge, having said his piece, retreated back into formality, reminding everyone of proper courtroom decorum as the bailiff signaled an end to the session. Journalists in the gallery stuttered into motion, scribbling notes, whispering hurried observations, and snapping last-minute photos. A few reached out to Jasmine for immediate comments, but she only nodded politely, choosing discretion over spectacle. This wasn't about glory, it was about principle, and she had proven hers without needing a final, theatrical flourish. But then, as Jasmine stepped away from the defense table, a small, unexpected ripple of applause began. It was low and respectful, not the kind of roaring cheer you might hear at a political rally, but a delicate acknowledgement that spread from one person to the next. She glanced over, realizing it came from a cluster of her White House colleagues, staffers, fellow attorneys, even a couple of senior advisors who had quietly slipped into the back rows to show support. None of them whistled or shouted. They just clapped gently, reverently, as though saluting not just her legal victory, but the moral stance she had taken. Jasmine paused, her eyes meeting theirs for an instant, and she gave them a subtle nod of gratitude. That moment, small yet profound, radiated through the room, filling the silence left by the judge's pronouncement. Some of the onlooking reporters briefly turned their cameras to capture this intimate display of solidarity. For once, there was no cynicism in their lenses, just an honest record of admiration between a professional and her peers. And for Jasmine, it felt like the truest applause she could receive, coming from people who had seen every piece of the puzzle and never lost faith in her integrity. Outside the courthouse, the media throng had already exploded into a spectacle of microphones and news vans. But the tone was different now, less hostile, more inquisitive. International correspondents from London, Berlin, and Tokyo were on standby, prepared to deliver updates to a global audience keen on the final twist of this sensational saga. Gone were the combative headlines screaming about press suppression. Instead, new banners scrolled across screens in bold letters: "Justice prevails," "White House attorney vindicated," or "Truth over sensation, Crockett cleared of wrongdoing." In a matter of hours, the narrative had pivoted, shifting from scandal to principle, from conflict to resolution. Various outlets that had once painted Jasmine as a media bullying operative now ran segments on her measured approach, her refusal to sensationalize, her decision to rely on pure evidence. Some anchors even praised her courage in releasing the full, unedited footage, describing it as a masterclass in transparency. Yet beneath all the coverage, a quiet realization pulsed. Had the frenzy not escalated so fiercely, the truth might have been lost forever. People began asking tougher questions about the nature of modern journalism, click-driven headlines, and the blurred lines between authentic inquiry and manufactured outrage. And in the midst of it all, Jasmine's name was no longer the object of debate. It was the beacon for a higher standard. By early evening, international outlets took the story further, dissecting every pivotal moment that led to the final dismissal of Maya's allegations. European newspapers, usually skeptical of American legal theatrics, marveled at the unfiltered candor of Jasmine's court strategy. Asian networks replayed her calm cross-examination clips, noting how she de-escalated tension by leaning on policy and procedure rather than emotional outbursts. News commentators highlighted that, in an era dominated by social media pile-ons and short attention spans, one woman's commitment to factual precision had triumphed over a well-crafted narrative of victimhood. Interviews with retired judges and foreign diplomats emphasized the significance. The case illustrated that due process, when armed with undisputed evidence, remained the best antidote to sensationalized claims. Even the Middle Eastern press, often wary of Western political scandals, covered Jasmine's victory as a testament to the quiet power of verifiable proof. Experts pointed out that while many modern controversies spiral into endless he said, she said shouting matches, this one had a single, pivotal piece of evidence so undeniable it cut through the noise like a scalpel. Meanwhile, Maya's global reputation was in tatters. No major outlet wanted to champion a journalist who'd been proven to manipulate the very medium she was sworn to uphold. And for the first time in ages, the international conversation around American politics was not about cynicism and division, but about a system that, given the right tools, could still self-correct. Inside the White House, the mood was oddly serene. Even though the trial hadn't been a formal government proceeding, many staffers felt it as a personal test, a reflection on whether the administration's confidence in Jasmine's moral compass was warranted. Now, with the court's ruling so definitively in her favor, a steady wave of congratulations circled through the corridors. A few senior officials left short notes on her desk, thanking her for setting a standard that no spin could dismantle. In hushed conversations, people acknowledged that the fiasco with Maya might have ended very differently had Jasmine been anything less than meticulous and unyielding. That day, no grand press release was issued from the Oval Office, no triumphant statements about victory or vindication. Yet the White House's internal communications buzzed with relief, a consensus that truth had held its ground against the relentless tides of perception. Some staffers quietly arranged for a small informal gathering, coffee and pastries in one of the break rooms, simply to acknowledge the emotional toll the trial had taken on everyone who believed in her. Jasmine arrived, offered a grateful but humble smile, and reminded them that this wasn't about one person's triumph. It was about confirming that regulations, properly upheld, could protect both governance and genuine reporting. She left the makeshift celebration early, citing a stack of work still waiting on her desk, but her eyes shone with a gratitude that no article or headline could ever fully capture. 3 days after the verdict, as the media gradually shifted its gaze to the next political scandal, a peculiar calm took hold of the air. The storm had dissipated, but its effects lingered. A sense that lines had been redrawn, that a new boundary had been set for reporters who might be tempted to stage an ambush for online clout. Maya Reynolds, once poised to become the face of resistance journalism, found herself effectively blacklisted by multiple outlets. A few local stations still offered her a platform, but the interviews were soft, more about her personal journey than any real investigative content. Meanwhile, op-eds and think pieces circulated, praising Jasmine for restoring a measure of sanity to a media landscape often ruled by clickbait. Everyone knew the conversation would evolve, that cynics would remain, that sensationalism wouldn't vanish overnight. Yet for a moment, there was a collective sigh of relief, proof that not every orchestrated meltdown ended in ruin for those with integrity. Jasmine, resolutely private, continued her work without fanfare, taking calls, drafting briefs, and ensuring that her name would be remembered less for a manufactured scandal and more for the standards she upheld. But the most telling marker of her legacy was found in whispered acknowledgments. She had stood in the middle of the storm, never lost her ground, and now the world had seen exactly who she was. The final echo of victory came when an international panel on press freedoms invited Jasmine to speak, not because she vanquished Maya, but because she embodied the precarious balance between fair scrutiny and responsible governance. Before stepping onto that stage, she reflected on everything that had led there. Every twisted headline, every public doubt, every whispered remark that she was too rigid or too cold. And she smiled not from pride, but from knowing she had proved that transparency wasn't a marketing tool, it was a principle. She began her address by quoting the judge's final words. "Justice does not serve emotion, it serves truth." Then she explained why that phrase mattered so deeply, not just in courtrooms, but in newsrooms and beyond. In a world drowning in half-truths and sound bites, she insisted that sometimes only the full story can save us. She recounted how standing firm in procedure and fact didn't have to conflict with human compassion. It merely separated real accountability from theatrical showdowns. Journalists in attendance took notes intently, some nodding, a few blinking back tears, recognizing the crisis within their own ranks. And when she finished, no one asked if she regretted anything, because they all understood that while emotion might spark a story, it is truth, in truth alone, that truly sets the stage for justice to prevail. From the previous moment of national reckoning to this quieter aftermath, where Maya's orchestrated drama had finally collapsed under the weight of unedited footage, Jasmine Crockett's story took a reflective turn. Days after the intense final verdict and the wave of international coverage vindicating her stance, Jasmine found herself sifting through a towering pile of letters, emails, and social media messages, some inquisitive, some apologetic, some grateful. Yet none of them had quite the same impact as a plain white envelope bearing the neat, youthful handwriting of a final-year journalism student, a young woman on the brink of entering the profession who confessed that she once saw the pursuit of news as a path to personal fame rather than a calling to illuminate hidden truths. In a single trembling page, that student admitted she'd nearly fallen into the same sensationalist trap that made Maya Reynolds famous for a fleeting second, until, by sheer chance, she watched Jasmine's uncut security footage. Footage that showed, beyond any doubt, how a predetermined headline could be manufactured by incessant interruptions and a calculated disregard for basic ethical standards, prompting the student to reevaluate not just her career goals, but the very essence of what it meant to report without bias. She wrote about how she had once dreamed of breaking big stories by amplifying conflict, cutting dialogue into salacious sound bites, and prioritizing viral clicks over the slow, unglamorous work of verifying facts, only to realize, after witnessing Jasmine's trial, that real journalism doesn't invent events or provoke confrontations merely for effect. It reveals occurrences honestly and allows the public to draw their own conclusions, forcing her to acknowledge that clicks and fame mean little if they're built on a scaffolding of distortions. The letter's raw honesty nearly brought a tear to Jasmine's eye as she recalled the relentless onslaught she had endured. From the early days, when even the judge seemed predisposed to see her as a tyrant, stifling free speech, to the barrage of hate messages painting her as the villain in a twisted morality play, and finally to that pivotal release of unedited footage that ended Maya's narrative in one dramatic burst of reality. Reading how this future journalist had been shocked into recognizing the thin line between uncovering a story and manufacturing one reaffirmed everything Jasmine had fought for. The notion that institutional protocols and factual integrity were neither dull nor bureaucratic, but the only sure defenses against manipulative theatrics. Sentence by sentence, the student detailed her own awakening, how every headline now felt suspect, how every snippet of audio or video demanded context, how she was slowly learning that the job of a reporter is to illuminate, not to orchestrate, and how, ironically, Maya's downfall became the object lesson that fame chases conflict, but truth requires patience. By the time Jasmine finished reading, she felt an odd rush of gratitude. Gratitude not for winning a high-profile case, but for the echoing validation that one steadfast stand against lies had resonated beyond the courtroom, seeding a question in the hearts of young journalists everywhere. Carefully folding the letter, she placed it in the top drawer of her desk, right next to her well-thumbed media access protocol, and as she did, a small, genuine smile broke across her face. Not the triumphant grin of someone who'd crushed an adversary, but the gentle, knowing smile of a person who realized that even though the battlefield had been harsh and the cost of defending the truth had been steep, she had not fought in vain. Days after that pivotal courtroom victory and the avalanche of public apologies from media outlets who had rushed to judgment, Jasmine Crockett found herself seated on a polished chrome stool beneath harsh studio lights, ready to address a national audience one more time. She was the featured guest on a special television forum dedicated to examining the modern fault lines between honest reporting and calculated spectacle, a topic that had unexpectedly defined her life for weeks. The studio's background glowed in bold shades of navy and silver, while the hushed murmur of the live audience suggested their anticipation for something more substantial than the usual chatter. Most of them already knew her story, a seasoned White House attorney who had dared to push back against a journalist's manipulative tactics, only to face a public trial both within and beyond the courtroom walls. Cameras panned across the crowd, revealing eager college reporters and skeptical older journalists, many curious whether she would condemn the press as a whole or refine the conversation about accountability in media. When the host, a suave man in his 40s known for incisive interviews, finally introduced her, the applause began softly as though the audience wasn't entirely certain whether to admire her restraint or applaud her courage. Jasmine offered a small, composed nod, aware that merely existing in this arena meant relitigating her entire battle against an orchestrated distortion of truth. The host leaned forward, exuding a palpable intensity as he explained the purpose of the night's broadcast: to dissect how inquisitiveness could morph into manipulation under the guise of free speech, thereby eroding public trust in journalism. Tapping his pen on the glass table, he declared, "We've invited Ms. Crockett here to help illuminate a problem haunting the world of modern reporting. Where do we draw the boundary between legitimate probing and a sham designed to spark clicks?" Under the bright lights, Jasmine displayed no outward flicker of unease, yet everyone watching sensed the gravity of her next words, knowing that her answers might challenge an entire industry's approach. She had stepped into controversies before, but never had the stakes felt so symbolically loaded, a crucible that would either reaffirm ethical journalism or expose how far it had strayed. After a brief montage showcasing recent controversies, from staged ambush interviews to sensational social media confrontations, the camera cut back to Jasmine, whose posture remained perfectly balanced, unmistakably poised, yet brimming with an undercurrent of resolve. She opened by underscoring that honest journalism was not merely tolerated, but vital to any functioning democracy, especially when holding powerful entities accountable. However, she quickly pivoted to addressing how a thirst for notoriety can easily corrupt such a noble mission, turning hard-hitting questions into little more than bait for viral confrontation. Her tone was calm, but the intensity in her eyes betrayed the harrowing weeks she had spent defending herself against pundits who labeled her a suppressor of free speech rather than a guardian of procedural law. The host, clearly intrigued, leaned in closer, urging her to specify the moment when healthy skepticism devolves into performative sensationalism. Jasmine, pausing to ensure her words were precise, recounted how Maya Reynolds had repeated the same question 5 times without seeking new information, steadily escalating the tension for the sake of spectacle rather than clarity. A ripple of recognition moved through the audience, several viewers recalling the now infamous footage that exposed Maya's whispered admission, "I've got my headline," capturing a craven desire for personal gain. Pressed further, Jasmine described how genuine tough questions always serve the public interest by demanding accountability, whereas contrived setups serve only the ego of the questioner. The host nodded gravely, noting that many viewers still struggled to differentiate between righteous, hard-nosed reporting and manipulative grandstanding. By the time she finished, the studio was quiet enough that one could hear the hum of the overhead lighting, a testament to the fragile line she had just defined. In that silence, the implications of her words seemed to linger, urging each individual to question their own role in perpetuating or dismantling the cycle of engineered controversies. Sensing the weight of her statements, the host posed the night's defining query with solemn intent. "So, Ms. Crockett, how do we recognize in real time whether a journalist's relentless push is rooted in genuine public interest or a carefully orchestrated stunt?" Jasmine, inhaling quietly, recalled every hour spent battling a system that nearly swallowed her whole, from the judge's unsettling partiality to the wave of media narratives pinning her as the antagonist. "We look at motive," she said, her voice calm but resonant. "If the questioner persists despite receiving thorough answers, if they weaponize repetition simply to provoke a meltdown, then it's likely not about discovery, but about fueling controversy." A subdued gasp rippled through the front row, where several young reporters tapped out notes on tablets, absorbing the lesson with evident fascination. Jasmine elaborated that authentic journalism involves a willingness to pivot when a question is answered, to refine queries as new facts emerge, and to treat the pursuit of truth like a living investigation rather than a rehearsed confrontation. The host acknowledged that many novices enter the field seduced by the adrenaline rush of takedown interviews, never realizing the long-term harm such tactics inflict on public discourse. Jasmine's gaze swept the audience, her eyes meeting those of a few older journalists who nodded in silent agreement, recalling how media ethics once demanded more rigor and fewer shortcuts. She concluded by reminding them that democracy thrives not on scandal, but on persistent, open-ended questioning that brings nuance to light instead of blotting it out. The hush that followed was thick with respect. It felt as though the entire room had exhaled together, ruminating on the stark truths she'd unveiled. Then ever so softly, she added, "A question that doesn't evolve with new evidence isn't a quest for truth. It's a quest for drama." It was in the final round of the discussion, however, that Jasmine delivered her most resonant statements, the kind that would be clipped and dissected for weeks to come, debated in journalism schools and editorial rooms alike. The host, attempting to wrap up, asked if she had any final words for those who believed her approach might stifle fearless journalism. Jasmine lifted her chin and answered without a hint of hesitation. "I'm not trying to muzzle real questions. I'm defending the premise that a true question seeks answers, not headlines." The studio erupted into applause, but she held up a hand to still the clamor, insisting that the public deserved more than reflexive cheers. "Manipulation," she continued in a quieter tone, "happens when a journalist turns a platform designed for truth into a stage for self-promotion, forgetting that the best reporting has never been about the reporter's ego." A panelist sitting to the side nodded vigorously, clearly moved by the sincerity in Jasmine's voice. Outside the glass walls of the studio, city lights glimmered, but inside the bright focus remained on a woman who had refused to let sensationalism define her character, even when it threatened her career and reputation. And as the camera pulled back for the closing shot, a group of college students holding homemade signs emerged in the background, one bearing the words, "Thank you for defending the truth," their quiet demonstration forming the show's most memorable image. Jasmine stood, gave a polite nod to the host, and walked away from the lights, passing the students who beamed with the kind of hope that only clarity and integrity can spark in a cynical age. For those watching at home, it was a final testament that real journalism, however uncomfortable or arduous, must never concede its soul for a fleeting viral moment, and that people like Jasmine Crockett, standing firm against the tide of theatrical distortion, remain indispensable for keeping that soul alive, no matter the cost. Right after the broadcast, social media erupted with clips of Jasmine's statements, provoking debates on journalism's obsession with spectacle. Major voices praised her, saying she refocused ethics more powerfully than any academic panel. Some skeptics admitted her refusal to vilify reporters, yet condemn manipulative tactics was a balanced stance. Dorm rooms and newsrooms replayed her words, marveling at the impact of calm clarity over chaos. A few outlets lauded her emphasis on context, calling it a guide for restoring nuance. Critics grumbled that her firmness might dampen bold questions, but that concern barely dented the consensus that truth-seeking and bravery coexist. By dawn, the hashtag #RealQuestions trended, urging audiences to demand depth over shallow drama. Jasmine woke to emails from reporters who felt inspired to recommit to ethical rigor. The conversation transcended her interview, revealing a public hunger for accountability without melodrama. In a media landscape starved for substance, she proved one steady voice could reorient an entire profession to its higher calling. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.